Death has always been an important ritual for the human experience, and no more so than in the Neolithic period, 6,500 years ago. It was the burial of the dead that gave us the first man-made monuments on the landscape of Great Britain. And so it is with the dead that we start this great exploration of England's past. I'm on a journey to Wiltshire to go and look for prehistoric man, if I can find him. In this series, I'm going to be travelling the breadth and width of Britain to explore our nation's historic past, from early man to the beginning of the 20th century. For accommodation and purely whimsical mode of transport, I'm taking an Ariba Puck, one of the smallest caravans in the world. But this means that I can stay close to the ancient sites or wake up on historic ground and get a real feeling for what went on before. In this programme, I'm heading to a very ancient county that has many remarkable features. Evidence of prehistoric man is often marked on the maps as tumuli, barrows, enclosures or earthworks, and when viewed from above, say in satellite photographs, as lumps and humps and bumps on the landscape. Now, Wiltshire is down towards the mid-southwest of Britain and boasts many famous landmarks. Stonehenge, of course, the mysterious Aubrey, and the peculiar Silbury Hill. But first, I've come to the Marlborough Downs in search of something very peculiar that stands abandoned in the middle of the countryside. As you can see, it's very congested up here and parking is a premium. To explore these early monuments, you do need a good pair of walking boots and reasonably fit pair of legs. Luckily, I have both. This is the Devil's Den. It looks a bit like a miniature Stonehenge, doesn't it? But it is actually a megalithic burial chamber of some 6,000 years. Now, of course, originally the whole area would have been covered in this massive mound of earth and chalk, and it would have been very impressive to look at. But unfortunately, due to the subsequent time and wind and everything else, all that's left now is just these rather impressive stones. These remarkable stones would have housed the bones of the deceased from the local Neolithic community. Covered with chalk and flint, the original mound would have stood roughly 230 foot long and held huge significance to the life of Britain's first farmers. Eerily, they now stand on the landscape, stripped of meaning. But people throughout the centuries have come and pondered, including the Reverend William Stukely, who drew the Devil's Den in the early 18th century. This is fantastic. All over the place, you'll see these scattered around here in Wiltshire. This is a sarsen stone. They call them the grey weatherers, scattered in the fields, on the farms, and here penned off so that people can come along and touch this ancient stone is this magnificent bit of rock, bit of sandstone that's been here for thousands of years. This wonderful sarsen stone is the same type of stone they used at Stonehenge, which is about 20 miles south from here. We're in the Marlborough district, and this is where this stone comes from. It's so weathered and beautiful. You can see the lichen and everything on it. I love it.
But I haven't got time to hang about. I'm off on a detour to the other side of the county to find the man who started the whole interest in these ancient monuments back in the 17th century. So we leave the Devil's Den in Marlborough and head to a tiny hamlet called Easton Piercy. The fellow I'm trying to track down was John Aubrey, the son of a wealthy farmer who studied at Oxford during the English Civil War and went on to pen observational sketches on his famous contemporaries in a book entitled Brief Lives. Lesser known and more important to me was his other work, Monumenta Britannica, a kind of survey of the home county's prehistoric antiquities, a work that was to inspire many antiquarians that were to follow him in the thirst for knowledge of our ancient past. And I'm looking for his birthplace. Now, there are plenty of clues to his presence, but is there anything genuine? Ah, this looks promising. Was this the house he was born in?
So, there it is, John Aubrey's birthplace. Lovely, lovely rambling building. Only, after he was born, it tumbled down and they had to rebuild it, using the stones and bits and pieces that fell off, of course. So, it's not actually the original. Oh.
A stone's throw north is St Margaret's, Delaware, where John Aubrey went to school, although I understand that even that has since been rebuilt. Now, that's what I was going to call a church school. I mean, it must have been a bit drafty in the winter. I wonder if he wore his long johns. John Aubrey is important to us because he introduced King Charles II to the mysterious stones at Avebury, and by doing so, stopping the farmers from pinching them to make their farm buildings with. He also surveyed Stonehenge and discovered a series of holes around the circumference, which were subsequently named after him. But my interest was that he listed and made important to the learned world the barrows, tumuli, burial chambers in Wiltshire.
The church is a walking distance, really, from his house, and it would have been a nice, quiet country atmosphere that John Aubrey would have found himself in. Unfortunately now, of course, it is slightly spoilt by this, the M4.
Which is my cue to get back to seeking out more ancient monuments.
Right, I'm going to take you somewhere special. In terms of barrows, it's quite famous and loads of people visit every year. But it's impressive, it's mystifying, and it baffles the brain. But better than that, you can go inside and it's free. And here it is, the West Kennet Long Barrow. In many ways, this is a bad example of an earthen long barrow. Firstly, because it's twice the length of normal ones, and secondly, it's got this accessible stone chamber. That makes it megalithic. But it is fabulous, though. This is incredible. Look at the size of this massive, great big stone here in front of the entrance. How many men would that have taken to have put into position? And all the knobs and crags on here. This is pure prehistoric history. Wonderful.
Work began on the 100-metre West Kennet Long Barrow about 3,600 years BC, which is some 400 years before the first stages of any work at Stonehenge. We see it now in its last phase, after it was sealed up and abandoned, although of course it's since been opened to the public.
I said earlier it was megalithic. That's because instead of building these burial chambers with timber, they've used stone. Let's go and take a look. I wonder if there's a bar. This is absolutely amazing. This is a chamber on the north side, small chamber. I've got to keep remembering that this is made by primitive man. Over here is another little chamber, tiny little chamber, where they would have put the bones and things like that in. This is on the south chamber, massive, big sandstone roof. And then further down here, as you come deeper into the West Kennet Long Barrow, there's another chamber on this side, on the south, one on the north here. But back here, you've got a much larger chamber, and this is called the West Chamber. Higher ceiling, beautiful, absolutely incredible. Really nice.
A burial chamber such as this held enormous significance to the Neolithic community. Originally, it was just a series of stone enclosures where the dead were brought with great reverence and placed inside over many generations. As time passed, it was covered and the mound started to take shape, a stone facade at the front built for rituals and feasts.
It was excavated twice, once in 1859 and then, more scientifically, about 100 years later. Bones were found inside. Now, nothing unusual in that, you might think. You'd expect to find bones in a tomb. Only these bones had a few peculiarities. When Stuart Pigott discovered the north and south chambers in 1955 as part of the more modern excavations, he discovered the remains of about 46 different people. But not skeletons as you might imagine, no. Curiously, the bones had been disarticulated first and spread between the chambers and then stacked up in an orderly fashion. And then the excavators discovered that the smaller bones, like the vertebrae, had been pushed into the crevices between the stones. And if you think that's pretty bizarre, all of the flesh had been cleaned off the bones before they were buried.
The dazzling white of the chalk mound would have stood out on the horizon, possibly as a territory marker or status symbol, warning other tribes or wandering herdsmen to keep well out.
Now then, I want to show you something else about this, which you can't see if you come here today. You see this trackway down here? There would have been a massive, great big channel, a quarry that came down several feet. It's where they used the earth and the chalk to actually build the mound. They've obviously got to get it from somewhere, and this is where they got it from. Hundreds of them with these antler tools hacking away, hacking out the chalk, and then finally building up the mound. Amazing. Yes, it's interesting. I've just been checking in my book about why the flesh had been removed from the bones. It's a book by Francis Pryor, Britain BC, and it's a good read, actually, particularly if you want to know all about your ancestors. Mine apparently had hair. Lots of it. I don't know if they wore it in ringlets or in a Mohican or something like that, but anyway, according to those who are in the profession to know, apparently our Neolithic fellow, let's call him Charlie, he believed in the fact that the life continued in the flesh, so in the skin, the flesh, the tissue, the muscle.
whereas the bones apparently didn't have the magic spark that we call life. And so therefore, when that was all that was left of our Neolithic man Charlie, he was deemed dead enough to be buried. I wonder if that's when Eve picked up her spare rib. Interesting.
Well, I was hoping to take you to the Knap Barrow in Hampshire, near a town called Andover. Well, it's on the Ordnance Survey map, as plain as the nose on your face, but the minute I get here and I have a look round, I can't see it. Where is it? It's gone. That's because it's been ploughed away by farmers over the years. Well, that can happen. Barrows do get ploughed in, they get forgotten. Not this one. It was excavated by Faith Morgan in 1957, and fortunately she found out some very interesting things that tell us about the typical life cycle of a long barrow.
Somewhere between 3,500 and 2,500 years BC, there was a small wooden mortuary enclosure. The dead would have been taken there. To the east was a small mortuary house. In time, the mortuary house was enlarged as it grew with greater significance. From the evidence of post holes, we know that it was surrounded with large upright posts, producing an impressive facade. Rituals and feasts are evident. Later, the mortuary enclosure was enlarged and made sturdier, and then, as the rituals changed, it was filled in with a mound of chalk and earth. The wooden flanking posts were burnt to the ground as they became obsolete. The earth mound was later enlarged to form a long barrow, and the whole monument was abandoned. In time, the chalk was covered by moss and grass, and the barrow remained at the mercy of the elements, until bit by bit, farmers slowly ploughed the grassy hump into the ground, where it has now gone forever.
So much for long barrows. What about the other myriad of tumuli on the landscape? Well, you don't have to go far in Wiltshire to see plenty of that. I've come up to the top of Overton Hill here, which is not too far away from the West Kennet Long Barrow, and I've come to look at these interesting lumps on the horizon. These are round barrows, and they come from the early Bronze Age period. Now, the difference between the long barrow and the round barrow is that whereas the long barrow is more associated with a communal burial chamber, the round barrow is much more associated with perhaps an individual or a family, a man, mother and child. Unfortunately, these have been plundered. Most of them have been plundered by the early antiquarian barrow diggers, which is a shame, as a lot of the finds now have all gone. The 18th century was the time when a lot of the early antiquarians started to get into plundering and pillaging the early monuments. Let's go forward and investigate one such barrow in Beckhampton that was plundered by one of the most famous antiquarians of them all. Well, this is the Beckhampton Road Long Barrow, such as it is. It's virtually all gone. There's nothing left of it. It's a raised hump at the moment, but at one time it was, of course, a respectable barrow. And Sir Richard Colt Hoare, one of the barrow excavators, came here and he looked at it and he said, "Oh yes, I think we can dig into that in a few minutes, have all the spoils and leg it."
Sir Richard Colt Hoare, a wealthy baronet of the 18th century, financed the earliest systematic diggings of the barrows of Wessex. He plundered over 400 burial tombs. he teamed up with William Cunnington, a wool merchant, and between the two of them they raped, pillaged and excavated, seeking the treasures of antiquity. Plenty of others were doing likewise, and we are fortunate that at least Hoare and Cunnington kept fairly concise notes of their activities. But how did they fare then at the Beckhampton Road Long Barrow?
Sir Richard Colt Hoare was going to be disappointed. He found nothing inside the barrow, just 3 ox skulls. Well, my journey in this programme has nearly come to an end. And whilst I could have taken you to hundreds of different Neolithic sites, I've decided to come up to the Cotswolds to discover one final megalithic burial chamber. This is the Bellis Knap, part of the Cotswold 7 series of ancient monuments.
Bellis Knap, literally translated, means beautiful hill or beautiful view, and there's certainly no shortage of those in the Cotswolds. The remains of 30 people have been found in the small chambers here, which for the size and effort to build seems a curiously small number.
This remarkable stone tomb is roughly 6,000 years old. It's 178 feet long, which is about half the length of the West Kennet long barrow we saw earlier. The interesting feature about this one is that there are 4 stone chambers around the sides, and one of them is a fake. Not this one, obviously. Well, this is one of the inside chambers, and I'm a little suspicious, to be honest, because although there's some lovely sarsen stones on here, around the side there's a lot of stone walling going on. The roof looks suspect as well. It's obviously been re-established. It's probably fallen to bits, and now they've poked about with it, made it safe for visitors. But originally, because the chambers came in on the sides and were separated, the experts believe that makes it an older chamber than, say, like the West Kennet Long Barrow, where they were all connected, because that was more complex. Still nice. So this is the main entrance, and as you can see, it's very impressive. A lovely great big sarsen stone here as well, and a big capstone at the top, and you would think that this is all kosher, but this is the fake one. They believe that the Neolithic people built it like so to prevent grave robbers coming in and actually taking their interned. So the grave robbers would come in and they'd dig around in here and grab all the stuff and what have you, and then realise there's nothing there, and perhaps then leave the rest of them alone. I don't know, maybe that's contentious. But this whole horn area out the front is definitely where they would have had the feasts, the festivals, the celebrations, as the Neolithic people buried their most important dead. Well, it's been a long day, and I'm entitled to a rest. But it's fascinating, isn't it? In the Mesolithic period, the time just prior to the period that we've been looking at, the time of the hunter-gatherer, death didn't seem to have much relevance at all to man. And yet, as soon as man started to put down some roots, as soon as he started to grow his own crops and farm his own animals, as soon as he started to get more sedentary in his lifestyle, death seems to have had some huge significance. And they've gone to such amazing extremes to put their tombs together. Now, interestingly, not everybody was buried in these things, as we've seen. With the West Kennet Long Barrow, only 40-odd people were found. There must have been hundreds that had produced the thing, so what happened to them, I wonder? But what's interesting for me is these monuments still exist after thousands of years on the British landscape. You can go and visit them, you can ogle at them, and you can touch them. And for me, it is a prime example of the first monuments of history that you can touch. Bye.